episode of Sri Lanka, a history of power in paradise. The year is 1977, and the new Republic of Sri Lanka is in the middle of a self-inflicted economic crisis. What happens next will change the course of our country's history forever. So let's recap what we have learned so far. Prime Minister Sirimavo Bandaranaike's left-wing coalition has fallen apart, and Lanka's great experiment with socialism is believed to have failed. Citizens are exasperated with the SLFP. The first constitution of the new republic has hard-coded Sinhala language and Buddhism into law, and the Tamil-speaking parties demand a separate state. And the ultra-left-wing JVP have shown that they are capable of extreme violence. The UNP victory in 1977 was so assured that at midnight on election day, before a single result came in, JR famously says to his colleagues, "I'm going home. It's time for some sleep. I'll need it for tomorrow." And went off home to bed. J.R. Jayawardene entered politics in 1943 and has seen 30 years of floundering. With a scholar's appetite for world politics, he diagnoses Sri Lanka's parliamentary system as far too unstable. A prime minister risks losing at every election, so they focus too much on maintaining a fragile majority. It is the Sri Lankan people and their economy paying the price. What Sri Lanka needs is to elect a president, like France. In a new constitution, he decides that people should elect this president independent of parliament and that they will serve a 6-year term. That executive then appoints the prime minister and cabinet ministers from the MPs and handles any subjects they choose. So, from head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the president has also now become the head of the government. The president can now appoint judges to higher courts and members to the Judicial Services Commission, which appoints judges to all other courts. They now bear a lot of individual responsibility. Much of what used to be done by the president on the prime minister's recommendation, which in turn was authorized by a cabinet, is now done mostly by the president acting alone. So, let's talk about this new government system. The government proposes most of the laws that become their policy, and Parliament, which represents the will of the people, is expected to debate and pass these laws, while also overlooking the executive and public finances. But if the independently elected president loses a majority, they could disrupt these activities by suspending Parliament and subverting their authority. The Cabinet of Ministers is also less independent, now enacting a powerful president's agenda. The Supreme Court can review bills in progress in case they violate the Constitution, but cannot strike down laws already passed. So now we are in the era of the powerful executive president, a role which most candidates have promised to abolish at nearly every election cycle since. With this level of control, JR is able to move fast on his economic agenda, which we cover in episode 3 of our series on economic history. But two forces are gathering power, and soon it will bring the country to its knees. The first is the defeated left wing. Now scattered, new parties emerge from the relic of the LSSP. The new president's labor reforms and rising prices bring their allied unions to a general strike in 1980. But the UNP have their own union, the Jatika Seva Sangamaya, to balance the scales of the unions allied to the left. 100,000 people joined the 1980 general strike, but violence erupts after a government worker is killed. Vikramabahu Karunaratne and Vasudeva Nanayakara are arrested. Then, railway and health workers join the strike, and the president declares a state of emergency. JR's Prime Minister, a young Ranasinghe Premadasa, sacks 40,000 strikers and asks MPs to find replacements from their constituencies for the new vacancies. Meanwhile, the government supporters received pensions, bonuses, and a monthly allowance for the rest of their lives. JR's government is now showing its teeth to the left wing. and they won't soon forget it. The second force are the Tamil-speaking parties fronted by the TULF, now the largest opposition party in parliament. Their leader, SJV Chelvanayakam, known for his non-violent methods, willingness to negotiate and reputation for incorruptibility, passes away after a fall related to his Parkinson's disease. For years, the Tamil Federalists have now lost credibility, and increasingly violent elements are breaking away, circling around the TULF, growing impatient for a separate state. The militant groups get bolder until one of them, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, kill a police officer in Kankasanturai in February 1977. A few months later, at a carnival held at Jaffna's St. Patrick's College, police get into a fight with carnival goers. It is the match lit to a country already doused in petrol, and the violence spreads like wildfire. August 1977 is some of the worst violence the country has seen against Tamils. Hundreds were killed, with many more, especially Malaya Tamil workers, made homeless. Alarmed by the rise in northern militancy, the government introduces the Prevention of Terrorism Act. What they say is a temporary law, authorizing police to detain people for long periods without trial and even admit forced confessions as evidence. Then, on July 23rd, an ambush in which the LTTE killed Sri Lankan soldiers explodes into a full-scale pogrom. Over the next several days and nights, Sinhalese mobs attacked and burned Tamil homes and shops all over the country, using voter registrations to identify Tamil families. The death toll was estimated at over 3,000, with hundreds of thousands displaced. Many tens of thousands of Tamils left the country, and several even joined the militant groups. Black July remains one of the darkest periods of Sri Lanka's history. JR now has a serious problem on his hands. He must address Tamil grievances soon before things fall apart. So, he proposes a district level of government as a compromise between centralized power and full statehood. He starts resettling Malaya Tamils in the north and then turns up the heat. At a June 1984 speech in Washington, he accuses the terrorists of wanting to create a Marxist state across all of Sri Lanka and even India, starting with Tamil Nadu. Sri Lanka is now on the radar of America's Cold War paranoia. The Tamil issue in Sri Lanka now has global attention. A last-ditch attempt to bring all parties together results in no compromise. The TULF want a bigger territory, combining both the north and the east. But the Sinhalese parties are joined by certain Buddhist clergy, vehemently opposed to separatism. The SLFP, whose leader Sirimavo has been banned from government by JR, withdraws from the talks entirely. Sri Lanka is now in the depths of civil war. With few options left, JR and India's new PM, Rajiv Gandhi, signed the Indo-Lanka Peace Accord in July 1987. The deal is this: Tamil rebel groups are to surrender their weapons to a military unit called the Indian Peacekeeping Force. Also, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is introduced. This proposes provincial councils with their own legislature and governors appointed by the president. The north and east were to be merged and expected to have devolved police powers and land rights. While the provincial councils were created, the rest of the amendment was largely left undone. Those opposing any change to the way Sri Lanka governs itself are furious. And now JR's first problem collides with his second one. The JVP, dormant for years, now take up the cause of Sinhalese ultra-nationalists, and they loudly oppose India meddling in Sri Lanka's affairs. They begin a campaign of attacks and assassinations in the south. Meanwhile, to the north, the Indian army scale up operations aggressively, and the LTTE start retaliating. 1988 is an election year. Jayawardene is now 82 years old and ready to retire. In this chaos, voter turnout was only 55%. And the UNP's Ranasinghe Premadasa is elected president of one of the most violent countries in the world. This is a feature of Sri Lanka's politics, a culture of violence and abductions from militant groups like the LTTE and JVP, as well as enforced disappearances of citizens by the state. One of the few groups speaking out against the violence is the Mothers Front, women whose children have disappeared in this intense atmosphere. They have engaged in fasting, street marches, legal action, and even negotiations with captors. Premadasa crushes the JVP insurgency, which has destabilized life in the south of Sri Lanka, so the military can be redeployed to the north. But he stays focused on his economic reform agenda and subduing political rivals. Then he gets a shock. In August 1991, a group within his own party claimed that they have 50% of parliament's signatures for a motion to impeach him. Party members are annoyed at how he restricts their freedoms, but mostly two formidable rivals, Lalit Athulatmudali and Gamini Disanayake, have been overlooked for the PM post and want to check his rise. The problems with the presidency are not going away. In 1993, President Premadasa is assassinated by the LTTE. With the UNP starting to fracture, the SLFP play their trump card, nominating a blue-blooded candidate. She is Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, known as CBK, and daughter of SWRD and Sirimavo Bandaranaike, both former Prime Ministers of Sri Lanka. CBK promises to end the war that has now gone on for over a decade and abolish the presidency. Then, the UNP candidate Gamini Disanayake is assassinated by the LTTE just 16 days before the election, destroying hopes for peace anytime soon. Sri Lanka is back to coalition politics, and CBK forms an alliance with her mother's old friends. All the old left parties and their People's Alliance win 62% of the vote. She introduces her own peace plan, believing the 13th Amendment engineered by Jayawardene doesn't go far enough. She proposes much further autonomy to the peripheries. This would cascade power from the centre to territories responsible for most matters except defence and foreign affairs. But it is complicated. She is negotiating not just with the Tamil parties, but also Buddhist clerics and a bruised UNP with a one-third blocking minority in parliament. Her rivals will not hand her a political victory so easily. This goes on for years with her support in steady decline. At the 2000 parliamentary elections, CBK's report card is dire, with the military having suffered setbacks in the war. The opposition spring into action. The Sri Lanka Muslim Congress breaks the deadlock by joining the UNP, and CBK faces defections. The following year, the People's Alliance loses its majority in parliament. Since 1978, presidential powers have only grown. Now those sitting across from the president finally have the numbers to clip the wings of this powerful force. The 17th Amendment of 2001 is a major effort to stop the president from having so much control over the country's institutions. Parliament is dissolved and a new election is held in December 2001. The UNP-led United National Front wins the House. But we also now have a strange situation. The UNP's Ranil Wickremesinghe, nephew of J.R. Jayawardene, is appointed Prime Minister, while CBK, his rival, is President. This uneasy cohabitation lasts for a surprising 3 years, during which time there is a ceasefire, hope, and a prospect of peace. An ambitious Wickremesinghe uses the ceasefire to gather billions in donor support and drive a reform agenda. The plan is to liberalize capital and labor markets and strengthen private property rights. But he is about to overplay his hand. His UNF coalition just doesn't have enough support from the opposition. The Norwegians are facilitating a peace process, which agreed with the LTTE to federalize Sri Lanka and recognize the right of internal self-determination to the Tamils. It plays straight into the hands of his political rivals, who revived the old trope of a Western conspiracy to control the country through its political elite. There is also a vocal group asking for a Buddhist state called the Sihala Urumaya, who is openly wondering if peace means that Sri Lanka will now be split into two countries. In 2004, the president sees just enough tension to dissolve parliament, calls for snap elections, and take over key ministries. CBK allies with the JVP, forming the United People's Freedom Alliance, and gets back control of the House. Peace talks are abandoned, and there is a return to fighting. On the 6th of April 2004, she appoints her Minister of Labour, Mahinda Rajapaksa, as PM. Later that year, the Indian Ocean tsunami devastates the country's coastline. The following year, at the 2005 presidential elections, Rajapaksa is the SLFP candidate, while Ranil Wickremesinghe contests from the UNP. But the LTTE forces a boycott in the north and east. Polling stations are barricaded on election day, with burning tires belching black smoke for miles. Not a single vote is cast in an area likely to have supported the UNP. The belief is that the LTTE have prevented Ranil from becoming president. Mahinda Rajapaksa narrowly wins the presidency, and to bolster support, he forms a large cabinet and appoints several non-cabinet ministers. In 1931, Ceylon had only 10 ministers. Now, there are 80. After a rapid drive, the civil wars brought to a violent military end in May 2009 with an enormous loss of life. It has been 3 decades and 100,000 casualties, but the brutal military conflict in Sri Lanka has ended. Rajapaksa sets about building his core Sinhala Buddhist support base, which is helped when he allies with the Jatika Helorumaya, an ultra-nationalist Sinhalese Buddhist party. Over the years, several opposition MPs have joined the UPFA alliance from other parties, and now they form a majority with a weakened opposition. But Sri Lanka's politics can be surprising. When the 2010 presidential elections are announced, a challenge comes from former Army Commander and Chief of Defence, General Sarath Fonseca, who is endorsed by both the UNP and the JVP. But there is not much difference between the UPFA party and the government machinery they control. There are reports of violence against opposition supporters and fraud during the election. Rajapaksa wins a second term in office. Then we visit a familiar topic, preoccupying the House for more than 3 decades. Newly re-elected President Rajapaksa introduces the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. This swings back much of the presidential power that the 17th Amendment had curtailed, including removing a 2-term limit on the president. The president can now seek re-election until death. The following year, Sarath Fonseca was given a 3-year prison sentence. A powerful new family dynasty is growing in Sri Lankan politics. It is 4 years later, at the 2014 Provincial Council elections, the UPFA is shaken by losses in their core base, and the UNP opposition prick up their ears. On October 20th, elections are confirmed for the following January. The UNP begins rallying support from other minority parties, while the UPFA faces a series of defections. For the first time in nearly a decade, there is a serious possibility of a change of government. Rumors of a common candidate start swirling. For a minute, let's talk about the cost of trying to get elected in Sri Lanka. Running for office is expensive. To become visible, candidates must buy advertisements, pay community leaders to gather supporters, and often arrange motorcades and security to appear powerful and important to voters. The way people get elected means that they must also canvass large territories. Once elected, an average MP's salary is 54,000 rupees plus benefits. But now you are expected to organize activities like rallies and health camps to benefit your constituents. So, if you are not already privately wealthy, you might need wealthy donors to help you out. Back to 2014. On an unusually cool November evening in Colombo, after announcing his intent to run for re-election, President Rajapaksa is sharing a dinner of hoppers with the General Secretary of the SLFP and his Minister of Health, Maithripala Sirisena. It is a meal that will later be compared to Judas Iscariot at the Last Supper. The following day, Sirisena arrives at a press conference. He begins with his palms folded and recites a Buddhist gatha. I respectfully thank the SLFP and the UNP for choosing me as a common candidate. Blinding flashes and the rapid click of camera shutters. He goes on. The government has moved in an unexpected direction. The 18th Amendment is a grave mistake. The entire economy and every aspect of society is controlled by one family. He talks for 20 minutes. Negotiations had been kept secret for weeks. Seated alongside him are SLFP ministers and the party's patron, former President Chandrika Kumaratunga. Calling themselves the United National Front for Good Governance, the coalition is the SLFP, the UNP, the Ceylon Workers' Congress, the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress, along with the JHU and TNA. Their new frontrunner Sirisena wins 51% of the vote, and the new PM is Ranil Wickremesinghe. The new government capitalizes on public expectation against a growing autocracy and cronyism to introduce the 19th Amendment. The presidency is now limited to 2 5-year terms. Some immunity is removed and they can no longer appoint themselves to any cabinet position. Dual citizens cannot run for office. The changes are quite specific. The Prime Minister is now head of a 30-member cabinet and the President cannot change them at will. Parliament is given some of its teeth back in the form of a 10-member Constitutional Council, which is like the government's HR department. Now, only through the advice of this council can the President make any appointments to 9 new commissions. These changes are meant to undo some of the damage done to the independent functioning of institutions, now full of loyalists appointed by previous presidents. Laws also cannot be rushed anymore. Previously, the Supreme Court had been given only up to 72 hours to decide on certain urgent bills of Parliament. Also, citizens would have the right to request information from public authorities. But let's look at who ultimately has power in Sri Lanka. A fifth of re-elected MPs are from political families, and it is getting worse. Nearly a quarter of the new representatives elected that year are from a dynasty. Out of 225 members of parliament, there are 29 allocated via the national list, meaning in proportion to votes parties get at a national level. This was a way for the smallest minorities, as well as women and subject matter experts who may not be elected, to be represented. But it can also be used to bring back defeated MPs and reward generous party donors. Add violence, the fact that most campaign rallies are at night, harassment, and the high cost to enter, and we start to see how many groups are kept out of power while keeping others in. For example, in a country where women are 51% of the population, they did not make even 6% of parliament, and in local government, not even 2%. A 25% quota for women candidates at local government and other changes are introduced to bring diversity. Again, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe gets ambitious around reform, but is hamstrung with only 106 out of 225 seats in parliament, a precarious position. There is a stab at trying to tidy up the nation's finances. Sri Lanka's state sector is a major employer. Years of politicians granting jobs in exchange for votes have bloated the state sector. And as we see, taxpayers ultimately bear these costs. But the fiercest criticism is that politicians and their families, when left in charge of state enterprises, without much oversight, tend to use them for private gain. And the evidence piles up. Inquiries reveal widespread misuse of state assets, bribery, corruption, and incompetence. The opposition accused the Yahapalanaya government of going on a witch hunt. By now, both a bad economy and its own corruption, like the 2015 bond scam, are starting to fracture Yahapalanaya. At the 2018 local government elections, SLPP candidates win 40% of the votes cast. The defeat is a reality check for the Yahapalanaya government. Then, in October 2018, President Sirisena announces that he would leave the Yahapalanaya coalition. Take the UPFA with him was removing Ranil Wickremesinghe and appointing Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister instead. Wickremesinghe refuses to vacate his post and requests the Speaker to convene an emergency session of Parliament. The President delays Parliament meeting and then tries to dissolve it. For 7 weeks, the country had 2 Prime Ministers until the Supreme Court declares the move unconstitutional and Wickremesinghe is restored. The coalition formed to oust President Mahinda Rajapaksa has come apart. President Sirisena brings the military and police under his direct control. The PM and State Minister for Defence are excluded from National Security Council meetings. With the government in tatters, the economy stagnates and Sri Lanka's credit is downgraded. Meanwhile, religious tensions have been brewing and escalating for over a year. In late February 2018, a restaurant owner in Ampara has his eatery set on fire when a rumor spreads that he is trying to sterilize Sinhalese customers through their food. Other Muslim businesses and places of worship are attacked. A few weeks later, a group of Muslim youth assaulted a truck driver near Kandy. He later dies from his injuries. Violence spreads from the center of the country as Sinhalese Buddhist mobs attack Muslim-owned businesses and emergency is declared. Then, on Easter Sunday, April 21st, 2019, a series of coordinated bomb attacks in Catholic churches and hotels leave hundreds dead and wounded. There is confusion, not just among the 7% of Sri Lankan Catholics, but in the wider population when a terror group inspired by ISIS claim responsibility. Gotabaya Rajapaksa announces his candidacy for president, leveraging a fractured coalition, promises of lower taxes and greater security to win over a frightened population. The changes that President Rajapaksa introduced may sound familiar to you by now, undoing almost everything the 19th Amendment did to reduce the president's power. But with COVID-19 and high public sector debt, the new president's challenges are related to both public health and a volatile economy. The events leading to our sovereign default are covered in our final episode of Sri Lanka's economic history. But then, something unusual happened. After pandemic disruptions and years of bad policies, the country's public finances have been crippled. Sri Lankans racked with shortages and hardship start coming out to protest the gross mismanagement of their economy. People call for system change, and their demands are wide-ranging. They ask for the 20th Amendment, which restores unchecked presidential power, to be abolished, for the president himself to resign, for the parliament to resign. But it went further back. As we learned, a group of political elites had negotiated Ceylonese independence, but those who felt excluded from the process were never satisfied. Communal politics had erupted into a decades-long civil war. Even with a violent close to the armed conflict, tension was never far from the surface. And then, the promise of a country where opportunity was supposed to be distributed equitably is now declared bankrupt, while it appears that corruption has enriched a select few. Those who spent over 100 days in protest also demanded the return of billions they believed to be stolen by a powerful inner circle, enabled by opacity and violence. It was a massive civilian movement. Tens of thousands gathered at the old State Council building at Gaulface. Even though lethal force was deployed, men and women took to the streets anyway. And when the former president fled the country on the 9th of July in 2022, immigration officers at the airport processed him not as a VIP, but a private citizen, in a small act of hopeful defiance. That year, Sri Lankans started asking themselves more questions about the economy, our leadership, and the culture of our politics. They asked, what leadership do we deserve? How can we do better? But more importantly, we realized the undeniable power of democracy when citizens unite to ask, what role do we have in changing this culture? How can we be better? Thank you for watching this final episode of our 3-part series on Sri Lanka, a history of power in paradise, brought to you by the hard work and support of a dedicated group of people. As always, Patta History hopes that in learning about our past, we can build a better future. Comment below, what was the most surprising thing that you learned from watching this final episode? And stay in touch with Patta History through our social media as we continue to tell stories of Sri Lanka's history. Click on the description box to learn how to support us on this journey.